Hello, I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tips, we're going to be talking about creating dynamic characters. If you're wondering what a dynamic character is, it's typically a character that undergoes some kind of change throughout the story. You know what these characters are. We've seen them in almost every book that you've read. Well, any good book, I should say. Dynamic characters, they have strong story arcs, they're interesting, you can relate to them. And that's the kind of characters that I think all writers should be aiming to create. So the first thing that we got to think about when we're creating a character is just the basic character creation. And I want you to think beyond just what they look like. If you were describing me, you would say, oh, she has reddish hair with maybe some pink in it and bluish green eyes, kind of pale, some freckles. But that's not who I am. That's just what I look like. And our characters need to be more than just our looks. So we need to start looking at what makes a person well-rounded. So you got to go into habits and hobbies and personality traits, religion, what their home life has been like in the past or currently, or the kind of life that they want to live. Those things are all really important to creating this more well-rounded character. And this seems like a no-brainer, but there's so many stories out there where the characters are missing some of these things. They don't have any hobbies outside of the one thing that the book's about. So, for example, a character might be really obsessed with television or comic books. And so the whole book is about them being obsessed with comic books, but there's nothing else to them other than that one thing. So our characters, if we want them to be dynamic, we need to create more to them beyond just those hobbies. We need to know, did they have a rough life growing up, or did they have a great life and so they're really well adjusted? Do they have good self-esteem? Do they not? I want you to think about people that it's okay to kind of borrow from our friends and family and use them in our stories. For example, I have a friend who doesn't go by his actual name. He's the third with that name, and he doesn't really like it, and so he goes by Trey, which stands for 3. I really liked that, and so I added that element to one of my stories. I like this idea of not really liking your name. I love my name, but some people don't, and they go by nicknames and things like that. That makes them more interesting. It gives you a little bit more about their character and the kind of person they are, or the kind of person they think they are. I'm not a Fernando, I'm a Trey. It's a great way to think about creating that roundedness that you want in a character. You could also just look at personality traits. Is this somebody who is quick to judge people? Are they, I had mentioned earlier, self-esteem. Do they have a high self-esteem or a low self-esteem? That's going to drive the story too, because we're talking about creating a character that's also going to help move the story along. If you've got a character who's quick to judge, then every situation that they go into at the beginning of the story is going to be somebody who's quick to judge, and that's going to drive their actions and what they do and how they react to things. So going into like the reactions and going into what they think, the second thing I want you to think about is, what does your character want? Jane Rush Thomas has this great quote that says, what is your character dying for want of? What would your character die for? What would they live for? I think that's an important part of that's not in that quote, but what would they die for? What would you die for? And think about that, really, like what drives you and motivates you to do the things that you do? Are you driven with a need to keep your family intact? If you have a character who that drive is there, then they are going to need to do certain things. So a good example of this is Hunger Games. A lot of people know this story, so it's really easy one to kind of talk about. The character in that story loves her sister. And so at the beginning of the first book, when her sister is chosen as a tribute, she immediately volunteers herself because she would die for her sister. And that is so important, that we have a character that we know what they want and we know what they're going to do for it. And it doesn't have to be good motivations, by the way. Her motivation is very altruistic, but it's okay if our characters are a little selfish at the beginning. Remember, we're creating dynamic characters, so we want them to change throughout the story. But it's okay if at the beginning of your story, maybe they are a little selfish in their motivations. Or maybe they're not even quite sure why they're doing it. They just know that they've got to change or something's got to be different. A flip side in a book that's kind of a companion, in my mind, is Divergent to Hunger Games. I read them at the same time, so for some reason I think of them kind of together. And to me, though, they are very different stories, because the main character in the second book, or in Divergent, is Triss, and Triss is not motivated by a love for her family. She does love her family, but she is willing to leave them in order to get a change and to do the things that she desires to do in her life. And so that is a different motivation. So talking about characters' motivations that maybe not as nice, everybody has reasons why they do something, even if the reason seems crazy to somebody else or doesn't make sense, or it's brought from a place of trauma. One of my favorite books is this book called The Root Cellar by Janet Lunn. If you haven't read it, you really should. It's a fantastic book. It has time travel and a really interesting dynamic character. And so the main character of this book, she is young. She has been orphaned at a young age, was raised by her grandmother, who was very nomadic, and they lived in hotels and just traveled the world. So she's been to Paris and she's been to Italy. And then her grandmother passed away, which all happens before the book even starts. And we meet our character, who's now going to live with some distant relatives. They're the only relatives she has left. And there are 3 boys. And the house is chaotic and it's loud. I mean, she's been an only child all her life. And here she is being thrown into this situation. And she is prickly. And she is grumpy, and she's not happy. And that all makes sense. You know, it makes the character interesting too, because we understand that when you go through something really hard or something's really different, that you as a person aren't going to be the same. And so it makes sense that these characters wouldn't be too. And it makes sense that this character in The Root Cellar is going to be a little prickly. But the best part is that you get to see that change slowly happen throughout the book. And that's what we want. We want to see her go from being prickly to being a little less so. But she doesn't quit being the person she is. And so that leads me to the next thing, is flaws. I want to talk a little bit about what is a flaw and what's not. Disabilities are not flaws. They're not character flaws. Disabilities can be things that a character needs to learn to deal with, but they are not flaws. And I want to make sure that there's a distinctive difference between those two things. A flaw is, bad habits that the character has, things that make them not able to meet the goals in their lives. Things that kind of hinder them. Now, disabilities can fall into that category, hinder you from becoming things or doing stuff, but I don't want you to think of a disability as a flaw. I think I just want to get it drilled in there. A flaw, if you want to think about a character, is like Anna Green Gables. Anna Green Gables is shown as being very headstrong and quick to anger. And although that helps her in some regards, it also really causes problems throughout her life. And throughout the series of the book, it causes her problems. But in the first book, if you've ever read it, or if you watched the movies or TV shows, or so much Anna Green Gables stuff, she allows her anger to almost destroy her chance of staying at Green Gables. And her anger also stops her from having a friendship with Gilbert Blythe for a really long time. It causes, so many problems in her life, and it takes her a while and into adulthood to really start to deal with that flaw and deal with it in a way that's appropriate, and to be angry when it's appropriate, but to also learn when it's not. And that makes her really interesting, and it gives us somewhere to go, right? If we start with a character who has this issue, then we can kind of work with that and build on that and create a character who's really dynamic. The fourth thing I want to talk about is history. Creating a background for your character. This background might not ever be seen by a reader, and that's okay. Tolkien wrote so much backstory for his books. The Silmarillion is basically a giant backstory that he created so that he knew in his head what the history of this world was, the history of his characters, the history of these different races and beings, so that he could create this really, really intricate and rich story. We need to do that with our characters as well. So when you're creating a character and you give them a background and you say, I have a character who I know his entire life before he was 11 years old or 16 years old when the story starts. I know about his mom, and I have in my head all these ideas of what his life was like and all these little stories. I've even written these little short stories that kind of talk about like these different memories that he would have. None of that is in my book, and it doesn't need to be. I don't need to go back and fill that in. That's not important. What's important is that I know he has a history, and I can kind of hint at that in the story so that you as the reader know that there's a little bit more to him than what I'm giving you. There's a past and a history that, and since it's written in first person, he's not telling you, and he doesn't want to tell you because it hurts. And that's really hard for him. And so that's a way of creating kind of these intricate, backgrounds for our characters. And I think the last thing, and we've talked about it several times, I mentioned it throughout the video, is character arcs. We want our characters to have some kind of story arc. All of the Harry Potter books do this. In each book there's a story arc, and then throughout all 7 books there's a very large story arc and character change. And so you can go read Harry and the other minor characters in the first book, and then you can read how he's changed and grown and things like that by the 7th book. And speaking of minor characters, your minor character should be just as dynamic as your major main character. Give them histories and flaws and a past and stuff. Like don't make them flat and archetypal and stereotypes. Nobody likes that. Even though we don't see them, they have a past and a history. The bully in your story, which we'll talk about antagonists in a later video, they have a history and a past and a reason why they're doing what they're doing. Your secondary characters are in the story, but they have a past and a history and a home that they go home to and everything. So you got to keep that in mind, that if you're creating this world, you need to like make sure that everybody is important and has agency and stuff like that. Even if they're in there for a second, you got to remember that in your world they have a whole life. We love to see it, and people love to see those things. So don't be afraid to put in the secondary character. So sorry, I got a little derailed on that one. But going back to character arc, we want to see our characters change throughout the story. And it is so fun to watch a character go from being just low self-esteem to discovering who they are and becoming better people, or it doesn't even have to be as drastic as that. A character who desperately wants their family to be normal, and then coming to terms with that in the end and saying, my family is not normal, and that's okay, and I'm going to live with that and just move on. You get to control that, but your character also controls that. By creating all those different things that I just talked about, you are now having a character who has agency and is allowed to kind of, create and build a story on their own. Because I want you to understand that as you build these characters and as you're writing, you're constantly asking yourself, why would my character do this? What is their motivation? If you have in your head what you want them to be like at the end, and that makes a story that is very character driven, which means that your character is kind of deciding what happens in the actions of the story, rather than like the plot is constantly moving things forward. And I love character-driven stories, and a lot of people do. So to reiterate, we want our characters to be well-rounded and interesting, and the best characters are the ones that have a history and they feel like real people. Real people connect with real people. So you want your characters to have that dynamic nature in which they are allowed to change and grow and build. Even in your fantasy stories, even in your science fiction, you want your characters to feel real so that your readers can connect to them. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to our channel. We post new writing tip videos every Friday for all types of writers. I've been Venus at Galaxy Inc. I hope your writing is out of this world.